Hello, and welcome to On Leading with Greatness. I'm Jim Salvucci. This week's installment, why great leaders think like philosophers, but move like realists. You better think. Think. Think about what you're trying to do to me. Think. Let your mind go, let yourself be free. Aretha Franklin and Ted White. Think. An intellectually rigorous systems thinker with strong skills in critical analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. A truth seeker, willing to confront and at times embrace ambiguity. A bold character, unafraid of or even invigorated by challenges and discomfort with a healthy mistrust of convention and the status quo. A superb communicator whose central role involves influencing others. A visionary devoted to the journey as much as the destination. What sort of a person am I describing? If you said a leader, you'd be perfectly correct. If you said a philosopher, you'd be equally correct. While there are traits and factors where leaders and philosophers significantly diverge, including their motivation to act, the methods and ends of their communication, their approach to risk, their willingness to compromise, and the imperative of the now versus the imperative of the precise, they also have a great deal in common. I won't say that leaders are philosophers in the same thoroughgoing way that they're teachers, but the overlap is unmistakable. All leaders must have a philosophical bent, but they have to be something more. Action is key to the leader's success, for instance, much less so for the philosopher. Still, it behooves the leader to consider the philosopher's way and embrace it wherever most beneficial, while understanding the differences between leadership and philosophy. The best leaders, unlike philosophers, are actors. By actors, I don't mean that they aspire to become thespians on stage or stars on a screen, although there may be an analogy to make there. I mean actors in the most basic sense. Leaders act. They do. It's part of their shtick. It goes with the gig. Where you find a boss who is reluctant to move ever, that boss is no leader. In this, leaders most differ from the philosopher. Philosophers contemplate with rigor. If you haven't thoroughly studied or been trained in philosophical thought and methodology, and I have not, then you would struggle to produce philosophical work that will stand up to scrutiny, as I do. Yet, effective leaders must have a bit of the philosopher in them, or more than a bit. No less a philosopher than Plato himself wrote of the philosopher king, the ruler who has the intellectual discipline and temperament of a philosopher. And while such beings have existed in history, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, comes immediately to mind, they are rare. In fact, we typically caricature and denigrate cerebral politicians and government officials as out of touch or wishy-washy, while celebrating the so-called realists who acts forcefully. We privilege decisive action from our leaders over deliberation, sometimes with cause, sometimes unfairly, and often at our peril. Plato, in contrast, surmised that a city run by a small group of deliberative thinkers would be ideal. Reality features far more nuance than either a literal reading of Plato or our lazy caricatures allow. Philosophers, like leaders, are people too, and subject to all the foibles and flaws common to every fellow member of the species. To cite a cliched truism, philosophers put on their pants one leg at a time, just like the rest of us. Or as Bob Dylan sang, but even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked. In other words, even the great philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius, had to put on his toga in whatever manner everyone else put on their togas back in 2nd century Rome. While the philosopher is by definition a thinker, a theorizer, not a doer, the true leader must do, but know that doing is not enough. Furthermore, the leader must display a pragmatism tempered with values that is not necessarily requisite in the philosopher. So leaders must do good and must do it well. So how does a leader assure consistency, not perfection, in doing good and doing it well? The leader must develop the self, their character, to reflect solid values. Part of one's character is the ethos or philosophy that one adheres to. The more rigor the leader brings to developing and assessing that philosophy, the more it will contribute to their character development. In other words, the leader must at least in private indulge in low-level philosophy. While Plato had a very specific ideal in mind when he theorized about his philosopher king, his ideal seems unlikely in application. Pure philosophers are simply not trained to act. The true philosopher leader must be deliberative, contemplative even, and highly aware of the principles and thinking that go into every decision. But the philosopher leader must also do. When it comes to those principles, the questions abound. Where do they come from? What do they mean? Do I adhere to them? Can I justify them? What are the applications of applying them? These are the queries that lurk constantly in the back, front, and center of the philosopher leader's mind. We can, by the way, use the phrase philosopher leader interchangeably with true leader or effective leader, since all leaders of any worth have some degree of a philosophical bent. And the best leaders are consciously aware of the importance and limitations of such contemplative ways and regularly employ them. Which is all to say that, despite media depictions and hagiographies of supposedly realist leaders who make snap decisions and value-only movement, real leaders need to be contemplative, more like a scholar than an action hero. But they need a bit of the action hero too. As with most things leadership, they must pull off a careful balancing act. That's the challenge, to be thoughtful enough to play the philosopher enough so that you're grounded in logic and principle while limiting your deliberation when action is needed. There's no precise formula or methodology to it. Just know that if you act without thought, you're probably wrong. And if you think without acting, you're wasting your time. Unless, of course, you're an actual philosopher, in which case, carry on. Which is not to say that sometimes there is no time to think before acting, while other times we may rightly think ourselves out of acting. See? No precise formula. That's the fun of leadership, rising to the challenge and rising above it constantly. You don't need to be a philosopher king all the time to be a good leader, but you do need to be open to the possibility and willing to try on the role when needed. How regularly do you consider before you act? How much do you value contemplation versus action? Great leaders must develop a philosopher's ethos alongside a realist's behavior, and I can help. Unlock the great leader within. Download my free resource, the Transform to Greatness Toolkit, now at thegreatleadershiptoolkit.com. By the way, don't forget my new book, Greater Than Great, available on Amazon. And check out my talk for TEDx Clarkstown, which you can find on YouTube. I look forward to hearing from you.